I flew to Manila to meet the woman who would save me, and lost everything instead. I am Stephen, 68 years old, and I spent over 40 years grinding away in a Pittsburgh steel mill, carefully building a retirement fund so I could spend my final years in peace and dignity. Today, that dignity is entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating shame because I lost absolutely everything, ending up completely and utterly broke. I am standing in the ruins of my own life, looking at what was left of my life, wondering how a man my age could have been so incredibly foolish to trade his entire existence for a masterfully orchestrated lie. You spend your whole life believing in the beautiful dream of finding the love of your life, someone to hold your hand when the days grow short. But for me, that beautiful dream violently morphed into a waking nightmare that I cannot escape. I traded my secure, predictable existence for a carefully constructed illusion in Manila, trading a lifetime of hard labor for a fantasy that evaporated the exact moment my funds hit zero. The financial ruin is devastating, but the psychological torture of knowing I willingly financed my own destruction is what truly keeps me awake at night. Now I have nothing but a cheap suitcase, waiting for a humiliating flight back to a country where I no longer have a home or a future. I am a broken man, confessing my greatest, most catastrophic mistake from a place of absolute, bottomless despair, hoping to warn others before they make the same fatal leap. I want to tell you exactly how this happened, step by step, because the path to this disaster didn't start with a massive theft. It started with a single, desperate click in a dark, empty room. Before the disaster in Manila, my life in Pittsburgh was an endless, suffocating cycle of gray routines and deafening silence. I had given 4 decades of my blood, sweat, and youth to the steel mills, retiring with a healthy pension but a painfully empty house that echoed with my own regrets. My divorce was decades behind me, my kids had moved on with their own busy lives, and my daily interactions were reduced to just nodding at the cashier at the local grocery store. I was a ghost haunting my own living room, feeling completely invisible and entirely discarded by the world outside my front door. The solitude wasn't just a quiet sadness. It was a heavy, physical weight pressing down on my chest from the moment I woke up until the moment I finally managed to fall asleep. My days were entirely devoid of purpose or passion, just a mechanical ticking off of hours until the sun went down again and I could safely retreat to my bed. I realized with absolute horror that my comfortable, completely paid-off house had slowly transformed into a sterile waiting room for death. I was simply sitting there, existing, without actually living, waiting for the inevitable end to claim me while the rest of the world spun on without me. I tried to fill the crushing void with hobbies, fixing up things around the house or watching endless hours of television, but absolutely nothing could silence the agonizing echo of my profound isolation. The harsh Pennsylvania winters only made the isolation worse, trapping me indoors with nothing but my memories and the chilling realization that my best years were permanently behind me. I felt a desperate, primal hunger to be seen, to be touched, to matter to someone before my time on this earth ran out completely. That desperate hunger is the exact vulnerability that the system preys upon, though my naive, hopeful ego completely prevented me from seeing the trap being set. As the months dragged on, the bitter cold and the deafening silence became too much to bear, and I started spending my evenings endlessly scrolling through the internet just to feel connected to something. I wasn't actively looking for financial ruin. I was just a tired, profoundly lonely old man looking for a tiny flicker of warmth in an incredibly cold and gray existence. I began to wonder if this was really how my story was supposed to end, fading away into absolute nothingness without anyone ever noticing my absence or mourning my passing. That desperate, suffocating fear of dying alone began to slowly crack open the door to a completely different, highly dangerous reality. It was during one of those bleak, freezing winter nights that I stumbled across a YouTube video about retired American men starting completely new lives overseas. They were sitting on sun-drenched beaches surrounded by smiling, vibrant local people, talking about a paradise where a modest pension made you a king and where older men were respected. The idea planted a powerful, intoxicating seed of hope in my exhausted mind, whispering that my life didn't have to end in this freezing, miserable waiting room. I decided right then that I was going to find a way out, completely unaware that this tiny seed of hope would rapidly blossom into my ultimate and complete destruction. The moment I discovered the concept of expatriate life in the Philippines, it felt exactly like finding a lush, life-saving oasis in the middle of a brutal, endless desert. I became utterly obsessed, spending night after night consuming thousands of videos, blogs, and forums detailing the incredibly low cost of living and the famously welcoming culture of Southeast Asia. Men just like me, gray-haired and tired, were suddenly living vibrant, colorful lives in Manila, their arms wrapped around gorgeous, attentive young women who seemed to adore them. The contrast to my miserable existence in Pittsburgh was so extreme, but it felt like I had uncovered the universe's greatest, best-kept secret for older men. I began to meticulously calculate my finances, realizing that my steelworker pension and my savings could theoretically provide me with a luxury lifestyle I could never afford back in the States. The logic seemed absolutely bulletproof. Why freeze in a lonely house when I could afford a beautiful condo, daily sunshine, and the constant companionship of someone who actually wanted to be around me? I started joining international dating sites, my heart racing with the kind of youthful, intoxicating excitement I hadn't felt since I was in my early 20s. I was no longer a discarded old man. I felt like a valuable prize entering a global market where I was finally in high demand and deeply appreciated. Then I saw her profile, and everything else in my life simply faded into the background as if it had never even existed. Her name was Marianne, a stunning 27-year-old from Manila with flawless skin, beautiful eyes, and a smile that seemed to radiate genuine warmth and pure innocence. Her profile didn't mention wanting a rich foreigner. It simply stated she was looking for an honest, mature man to share a simple, loyal life with. It was the exact fantasy my lonely mind had been desperately craving, perfectly packaged and presented to me on a glowing screen, hiding the venomous trap waiting underneath. I spent hours agonizing over her photos, marveling at how someone so young and incredibly beautiful could possibly be interested in a rugged, aging steelworker from Pennsylvania. But the expat forums had assured me that in their culture, age was a sign of wisdom and stability, and that local women genuinely preferred older, established men over reckless youth. I swallowed the cultural rationalization completely, using it to aggressively silence the tiny, rational voice in my head that whispered this was entirely too good to be true. I convinced myself that I had simply suffered enough in life and that the universe was finally rewarding me with this beautiful, life-changing oasis. Gathering every ounce of courage I had left, I crafted a careful, polite introduction message, my hands physically shaking over the keyboard as I nervously hit the send button. I stared at the screen, holding my breath, convinced she would ignore me and that my brief flicker of hope would be extinguished just as quickly as it had ignited. But less than 5 minutes later, a little notification popped up on my screen, accompanied by a sweet, enthusiastic reply that made my heart violently pound out of my chest. It was the exact moment I stepped off the edge of the cliff, completely unaware of the devastating fall that awaited me at the bottom. The next 6 months were a blinding, intoxicating whirlwind of late-night video calls, endless text messages, and a level of intense affection I had never experienced in my entire life. Marianne was incredibly attentive, always asking about my day, listening to my boring stories about the steel mill as if they were the most fascinating tales she had ever heard. She made me feel powerful, interesting, and deeply desired, completely erasing the decades of invisibility that had plagued me in the United States. Our relationship felt like stepping into a perfect movie script, where every single line and interaction was meticulously designed to make me feel like the ultimate leading man. I was utterly captivated by her voice, her mannerisms, and the way she seemed to anticipate my every emotional need before I even opened my mouth to speak. She didn't ask for expensive gifts or luxurious promises. She just told me how much she wished I was there to hold her and protect her from the harsh realities of Manila. My protective instincts went into absolute overdrive, fueling my ego and cementing my belief that I was her savior, the strong American man destined to rescue her. I was so completely engrossed in playing my part in this perfect movie script that I completely failed to realize I was just an actor being expertly directed. When I finally booked my first flight to the Philippines, my excitement was so intense it felt like electricity coursing through my aging, tired veins. The grueling, long-haul journey felt like a brief moment in time, my mind entirely focused on the magical moment I would finally pull her into my arms at the arrivals gate. When I walked out of the terminal into the sweltering heat of Manila, she was standing there, looking even more stunning than her pictures, running towards me with tears in her eyes. It was the single happiest moment of my life, a flawless cinematic climax that effectively blinded me to the horrifying reality of my impending situation. During that first trip, I was treated like an absolute king, showered with a level of physical affection and devotion that I thought only existed in fictional romance novels. Marianne took me to beautiful places, introduced me to the vibrant local culture, and never once let go of my hand as we walked through the crowded, chaotic streets of the city. I felt 30 years younger, my aches and pains magically vanishing, replaced by the surging adrenaline of being madly in love and desperately desired by someone out of my league. The illusion was completely flawless, a meticulously crafted bubble that kept all my rational thoughts and suspicions locked securely on the outside. She introduced me to her family, who welcomed me into their modest home with open arms, cooking feasts in my honor and treating me with immense, almost overwhelming respect. I sat at their table, listening to their laughter and feeling a profound sense of belonging that I hadn't felt since my own family fractured decades ago. I believed with every fiber of my being that I was being integrated into a tight-knit, loving community, completely blind to the fact that I was actually being assessed for my financial capacity. I was the golden goose, but I thought I was simply the highly honored and beloved guest. When I had to return to Pittsburgh, saying goodbye at the airport was agonizing, filled with genuine tears on my end and what I now know were expertly acted tears on hers. I flew back to America with a completely changed mindset. My gray house was no longer a waiting room for death, but simply a temporary storage facility before my new life began. I immediately started the process of selling my home, cashing out my retirement accounts, and liquidating every single asset I had spent 40 years breaking my back to acquire. I was going to move to Manila permanently, to marry the woman of my dreams, and live out my final days in an absolute tropical paradise. The planning phase was purely euphoric, fueled by daily video calls where we talked endlessly about our future, the condo we would rent, and the beautiful life we would build together. Marianne was heavily involved in the logistics, helping me find the perfect apartment in a luxurious, safe area where wealthy expats lived like modern royalty. I didn't care about the exorbitant rental prices because my bank account was suddenly flush with hundreds of thousands of dollars from the sale of my house and 401k. I was completely invincible, floating on a cloud of absolute financial security and unconditional, blinding romantic love. I arrived back in Manila with a suitcase full of clothes and a digital bank account holding my entire life's work, ready to start the final, most glorious chapter of my existence. Our new condo was beautiful, and living together felt incredibly easy, harmonious, and filled with the kind of daily joy I thought I had lost forever. She cooked for me, took care of the apartment, and made me feel like the undisputed master of my domain, stroking my ego with terrifying precision and calculating grace. I was so blissfully happy, so entirely consumed by the fantasy, but the subtle shifts in her behavior completely failed to register on my radar. We spent our days exploring high-end malls, dining at expensive restaurants, and living a lifestyle that would have bankrupted me in a month back in the United States. I paid for everything, of course, proudly pulling out my credit card to demonstrate my ability to provide, completely oblivious to how closely she was tracking my spending habits. I was so eager to prove that I was a capable, generous partner, but I actively encouraged the financial imbalance, essentially handing her the blueprint to my own destruction. I thought I was buying her happiness, but I was actually just paying the premium on a masterfully executed emotional insurance policy. As the weeks turned into a couple of months, the intense, overwhelming affection slowly started to settle into a comfortable, slightly more routine domestic dynamic. The endless declarations of love became slightly less frequent, and she started spending more time on her phone, texting friends, which I simply brushed off as normal behavior. I was so terrified of being seen as controlling or jealous that I bent over backwards to give her space, completely ignoring the tiny nagging feeling in my gut that something was off. I was living inside my perfect movie script, and I absolutely refused to let any critical thinking ruin the beautiful scenes I was actively participating in. I vividly remember sitting on the balcony one evening, sipping a cold drink and watching the sunset over the Manila skyline, feeling an overwhelming sense of absolute triumph. I looked at Marianne, whose face was illuminated by the glow of her smartphone, and I felt a surge of pure pride that I had finally beaten the system. I had escaped the grim fate of the lonely American senior, and I had secured my happiness with the wealth I had rightfully earned. Looking back, I should have realized that it was all entirely too good to be true, that a perfect script always has a devastating catch, but I simply didn't want to see it. The very first time she asked me for money outside of our normal living expenses, she was incredibly hesitant, her eyes filled with tears and her voice trembling with manufactured shame. She explained that her younger cousin had contracted a severe fever, and the family couldn't afford the hospital admission fee or the life-saving antibiotics required. It was only $300, an absolutely trivial amount compared to my massive savings, and I felt a surge of pride in being able to instantly solve her family's terrifying crisis. I viewed my bank account like a massive water reservoir, and this was just a tiny, insignificant drop being shared to prove my unwavering commitment and reliability. I handed over the cash without a second thought, completely unaware that this tiny drop was actually the very first small crack in the dam that protected my entire life savings. A few weeks later, another emotional crisis magically appeared. This time it was her uncle's roof that had collapsed, leaving her elderly relatives sleeping in the brutal rain. The cost to repair it was $1,000, and while I hesitated for a brief second, she looked at me with such absolute devastation that my resolve instantly crumbled into dust. I told myself that a good partner takes care of his family, rationalizing the expense as a necessary investment in the harmony and stability of my new life. The cracks in my financial reservoir began to multiply rapidly as the requests became slightly more frequent, always shrouded in a desperate, undeniable emotional urgency. Her brother needed a new laptop for his university studies, a vital tool for his future, but only the rich American could possibly provide, costing me another $1,500. I remember feeling a slight twinge of irritation, a tiny whisper of doubt, but I quickly silenced it by reminding myself of her constant affection and the incredible intimacy we shared. I convinced myself that I was building an unshakable loyalty, entirely oblivious to the fact, but I was simply training them on how easily I could be manipulated. Then came the endless medical bills for her mother, an exhausting series of specialist appointments, mysterious prescriptions, and expensive tests that always required cash up front. I was shelling out $500 here, $800 there, watching my monthly budget inflate wildly beyond anything I had projected back in Pennsylvania. When I gently suggested that we needed to be slightly more careful with our spending, the atmosphere in our condo instantly turned freezing cold, and the affection was abruptly withdrawn. I panicked, terrified of losing the fantasy I had sacrificed everything for, and immediately paid the next medical bill just to restore the fragile peace and warmth. The request soon shifted from absolute emergencies to what she cleverly framed as necessary upgrades for our shared social standing in the expat community. She needed a newer, more expensive smartphone to stay in contact with me, and an entirely new wardrobe to accompany me to the high-end restaurants I enjoyed. Every single request was presented as something she was doing for us, to make me look better, and my foolish ego swallowed the manipulation completely. I was plugging the growing cracks in my reservoir with my own hard-earned cash, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of absolute control while my resources rapidly drained away. The situation escalated when she informed me that her family was struggling with the rent on their modest apartment and were facing imminent eviction if we didn't step in to help. The solution, she explained, with tears streaming down her face, was for us to pay their monthly rent, an amount that was a substantial permanent drain on my funds. I argued, feeling the intense pressure of being turned into a human ATM, but she expertly weaponized my guilt, asking if I truly loved her while her family was thrown into the streets. I surrendered, adding a permanent recurring leak to my financial reservoir, rationalizing that peace of mind was worth the extra monthly expense. Despite the constant financial drain, I absolutely refused to connect the dots, desperately clinging to the belief that I was simply experiencing the normal cultural obligations of dating in the Philippines. I ignored the glaring reality that her family seemed perfectly healthy and capable of working, yet somehow entirely dependent on the retirement funds of a former steelworker. I began hiding my bank statements, not just from her, but from myself, terrified to acknowledge how quickly the numbers were dropping month after month. The reservoir was cracking violently now, water spraying everywhere. But I stood there smiling, desperately pretending, but everything was perfectly dry and exactly according to plan. The dynamic of our relationship had fundamentally shifted. The intense, passionate romance of the honeymoon phase was completely gone, replaced by a highly transactional arrangement. She was only truly affectionate and attentive in the days immediately following a large financial transfer, and cold, distant, and irritable whenever I attempted to enforce a boundary. I was paying exorbitant emotional taxes just to keep her in the apartment, trading my dignity for the mere presence of a person who was systematically bleeding me dry. Yet every time I considered walking away, the paralyzing fear of returning to that gray, silent house in Pittsburgh forced me to open my wallet once again. To cope with the mounting anxiety, I started self-medicating, spending my afternoons drinking expensive beers on the balcony while she was out running errands with my credit card. I would sit there, slightly numb, desperately trying to mentally justify the fact that my retirement fund had shrunk by 20% in less than a single year. I told myself that the initial setup costs were always the highest, and that soon the emergencies would stop and we could finally settle into a cheap, peaceful routine. It was a pathetic, transparent lie that I whispered to myself to avoid facing the agonizing truth that I was being professionally and ruthlessly scammed. The red flags were no longer just flapping in the wind. They were practically wrapping themselves around my neck and choking the life out of me. Yet I absolutely refused to see them. I noticed she would frequently receive late-night text messages that she immediately deleted, and she would often take calls in the bathroom with the shower running. When I confronted her, she aggressively flipped the script, accusing me of being a paranoid, controlling old man who didn't trust the person who had given up everything for him. The guilt trip worked flawlessly. I backed down, apologized profusely, and bought her an expensive piece of jewelry just to prove my unwavering trust and devotion. I was entirely trapped in a psychological prison of my own making, utterly terrified of being alone, but equally terrified of the terrifying speed at which my life savings were vanishing. I was bleeding money from a dozen different invisible wounds: family rent, endless medical bills, new technology, and her daily allowance to keep her happy and compliant. The water in my financial reservoir was dropping at a catastrophic rate, but I was so invested in the illusion, so desperate to prove the skeptics wrong, but I couldn't stop. I had tied my entire sense of self-worth to my ability to provide, completely ignoring the fact that I was providing for a bottomless, insatiable void. Looking back, the most devastating realization is how willingly I participated in my own financial execution, how eagerly I handed over the very weapons used to destroy me. I ignored every single instinct, every rational thought, and every blaring alarm bell because admitting I was a fool was a pain I simply couldn't tolerate. I convinced myself that we just needed one major final move to secure our independence from her family's demands, one big play that would finally stabilize our lives. I was desperate for a permanent solution to the endless leaks, completely unaware that I was about to deliberately blow the entire damn dam wide open. The fatal blow was presented to me not as a desperate plea for help, but as a brilliant, incredibly lucrative business opportunity that would permanently secure our financial future. Marianne supposedly had the exclusive connections to purchase a prime piece of commercial real estate in the province, perfect for building a high-yield apartment complex for local workers. She explained that foreigners couldn't legally own land, so the property and the business would have to be entirely in her name, but that the massive monthly profits would be ours. It was pitched as the ultimate escape from the endless family requests. We would build them a business, and they would finally be completely financially independent. A terrifying cold sweat broke out across my back, because the amount of money required to purchase the land and fund the construction was absolutely staggering. It was my remaining savings. I spent 3 sleepless nights aggressively researching common scams in the Philippines, reading countless horror stories of foreign men who bought land in a local's name only to be evicted. The warnings were explicitly clear, written in giant letters across every single expat forum I visited. Never, under any circumstances, buy property in someone else's name. I read the tragic stories of ruined men, recognizing the exact same patterns, the exact same promises, and the exact same red flags that were dominating my life. But the psychological grip she had on me was absolute, and when I brought up my fears, she didn't get angry, she simply wept, a devastating display of completely shattered trust. She packed a small bag and walked to the door, telling me that if I truly believed she was a criminal who would steal from her future partner, then the relationship was already dead. The sheer panic of watching her walk away, of facing the reality of being a 68-year-old failure alone in a foreign country, completely overrode decades of rational common sense. I begged her to stay, apologizing frantically, desperately trying to prove that I wasn't like the paranoid men on the internet and that my love was completely unconditional. To prove my absolute devotion, I completely ignored every single warning I had read, treating this monumental financial decision like a grand, romantic leap of faith into the unknown. I convinced myself that those other men had simply chosen the wrong people, but my Marianne was different, our love was special, and this investment was the ultimate proof. I was standing at the edge of a terrifying, jagged cliff, staring down into the dark abyss, but the illusion promised me that majestic wings would magically sprout on the way down. I was trading the absolute security of my lifelong labor for the fragile, incredibly dangerous promise of a 27-year-old's loyalty. The paperwork was drawn up entirely in Tagalog, a language I couldn't read a single word of. But I sat in the attorney's office and smiled, playing the wealthy provider to absolute perfection. I watched her sign her name on the massive stack of documents, completely legally transferring the ownership of my life's work entirely into her absolute control. I felt a sickening, profound knot forming deep in my stomach, a primal, screaming instinct that I was making a catastrophic mistake. But I forced the feeling down with a fake smile. I had entirely surrendered the keys to my survival, hoping against all reason, but my massive sacrifice would finally buy the love and security I so desperately craved. The next morning we went to the International Bank branch. the sterile air conditioning chilling the sweat that had gathered on the back of my neck as I sat before the teller. I handed over my passport and the authorization forms, my voice barely a whisper, as I instructed the bank to wire the massive sum into her local account. The teller pushed the final confirmation slip across the polished desk, and as I dragged my pen across the signature line, my hand shook so violently I could barely form the letters. I authorized the transfer, sealing my own financial death warrant, holding on to the blind hope that my leap of faith wouldn't end in a devastating crash. The construction of our supposed apartment complex began immediately, or at least the endless requests for additional material, funds, and permits began to completely drain my final reserves. Marianne started traveling to the province constantly, claiming she needed to aggressively oversee the building site, leaving me alone in our expensive Manila condo for weeks at a time. The video calls became incredibly rare. The text messages turned into short, cold demands for more cash, and the suffocating loneliness I had fled Pittsburgh to escape came rushing back. I was entirely isolated, rapidly running out of money, and deeply paralyzed by a growing, sickening suspicion that my perfect movie script was actually a horror film. One incredibly humid Tuesday afternoon, I decided to surprise her at the province site, desperately needing to see the physical proof of my massive investment to calm my spiraling anxiety. I hired a private driver, navigating hours of brutal, chaotic traffic, clinging to the hope that I would arrive and find her proudly managing our future empire. When the driver finally pulled up to the exact address listed on the official land deeds, my heart completely stopped in my chest, and all the oxygen was violently sucked from my lungs. There was no construction site, no cement mixers. There was only an enormous, extravagant, completely finished luxury villa sitting behind a massive fortified iron gate. I forced the heavy gate open, my legs feeling like they were made of absolute lead, and walked into the sprawling, perfectly manicured courtyard, entirely unable to process the reality. Sitting by a beautiful swimming pool was Marianne, laughing loudly, entirely wrapped in the arms of a young, muscular Filipino man who was drinking a beer paid for with my blood. She froze when she saw me, but there was no panic, no guilt, no scrambling to explain. Instead, her face hardened into a mask of pure, absolute contempt that chilled me to the bone. The grand illusion shattered into a million jagged pieces in a single millisecond, exposing the horrifying, grotesque truth that had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. "What are you doing here, Stephen?" she demanded, her voice entirely stripped of the sweet, high-pitched innocence I had fallen in love with, replaced by a harsh tone I had never heard. The young man stood up, aggressively posturing, as she coldly explained that this was her house, built on her land, and that the young man beside her was her actual, long-term husband. The words hit me like physical blows to the skull, my brain desperately misfiring, entirely unable to comprehend how the sweet girl from my fantasy could be this ruthless stranger. But the absolute worst, most mind-shattering revelation was yet to come, delivered with a cruel, mocking smile that will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. As I stood there stammering, demanding my money back and threatening to call the police, she let out a loud, genuine laugh that completely destroyed the last remaining shreds of my sanity. In that moment, the voice, the face, everything changed, and I realized I had never really known who she was. "You really are a stupid old man," she spat. The woman I sacrificed my entire life savings for never even existed. I literally fell to my knees on the hot concrete of the courtyard I had paid for, my chest heaving as I gasped for air, completely crushed under the weight of my colossal stupidity. I had willingly surrendered 40 years of backbreaking labor in the steel mills to a phantom, a meticulously designed character played by an actor who was now staring at me with disgust. The husband stepped forward, grabbing me roughly by the collar and dragging me out of the gate like a piece of worthless garbage, tossing me onto the dusty street outside. The heavy iron gate slammed completely shut, a deafening final boom that signaled the heavy curtain violently falling mid-act, leaving me entirely alone in the dark. The immediate aftermath was a blur of absolute paralyzing trauma and a humiliating descent into a level of poverty I hadn't experienced since I was a destitute child. I stumbled back to Manila, my mind entirely fractured, only to find that the lease was terminated and all my cheap belongings had been thrown into the lobby. I frantically checked my bank applications on my phone, praying for a miracle, but in that moment I realized my entire life was gone. My massive retirement fund, my beautiful house in Pittsburgh, my 40 years of grueling labor, it had all been violently incinerated, leaving absolutely nothing but toxic ash. I went to the local police station, desperately trying to file a report, but the officers simply looked at me with a mixture of pity and exhausted annoyance. They explained that I had legally, voluntarily wired the money, but the name was exclusively on the land titles, and that I had absolutely zero legal recourse in a country where I was a guest. They practically laughed me out of the precinct, telling me that this exact story happens every single day to men exactly like me who think they can buy love in a foreign country. I was completely, utterly powerless, a completely stripped carcass left to rot on the side of the road while the predators moved on to their next wealthy victim. For 3 agonizing nights, I slept on a filthy bench outside a cheap convenience store in Manila, terrified, vulnerable, and deeply contemplating ending my own miserable life just to escape the shame. I couldn't bear the thought of calling my estranged family or my old co-workers back home, knowing they would look at me with the harsh judgment that I entirely deserved this fate. I had traded the respect of my community for a cheap plastic illusion, and now I was paying the ultimate unforgiving price for my arrogant, delusional ego. I was completely invisible again, but this time I wasn't just lonely. I was a pathetic, broken beggar stranded 10,000 miles from the only home I had ever known. Finally, completely broken and starving, I was forced to walk into the American Embassy, entirely stripping away the last remaining microscopic shred of my dignity to beg for a repatriation loan. I sat in the sterile waiting room, surrounded by other defeated, ruined old men with exactly the same empty, haunted look in their eyes, realizing I was just an unoriginal cliché. I signed the government promissory note, legally binding myself to repay the cost of my rescue flight, a massive debt I have absolutely no way of ever settling in my destitute reality. I was handed a cheap economy ticket back to Pennsylvania, a completely worthless piece of paper that represented the absolute devastating failure of my grand escape plan. When I finally arrived back at the Pittsburgh International Airport, the freezing air hit my face like a physical assault, a brutal welcome back to the reality I had tried to escape. I stood completely alone on the curb, clutching my single, battered suitcase, waiting for the bus that would take me to a cheap, state-funded homeless shelter because I had nowhere to go. I looked exactly like a traumatized shipwreck survivor washing up on a cold, barren beach, wearing nothing but the ragged clothes on my back. I was forced to stare out at the distant, mocking ocean where my magnificent ship had violently sunk, completely destroyed by my own terrible decisions. I am not telling you this agonizing, deeply humiliating story to gain your sympathy, because I know perfectly well that I am entirely responsible for my own catastrophic destruction. I am speaking directly to the older, lonely men sitting in their quiet living rooms right now, staring at their screens and desperately hoping that the beautiful young person messaging them is the exception. Let me be absolutely, brutally clear with you. They are not the exception. Your love is not special, and you are actively playing a high-stakes game against a ruthless system. You are nothing but a walking bank account to them, a temporary financial host that will be mercilessly drained and discarded the exact second your funds are exhausted. If you are thinking about retiring overseas to find a young partner, I am begging you to violently wake up from this lethal delusion before it costs you your entire life. Never, under any circumstances, send money for family emergencies. Absolutely refuse to buy land or businesses in anyone else's name, and permanently lock away your life savings. You must understand that the intense affection you are receiving is a highly practiced professional performance, and the moment you cut off the financial supply, you will be left entirely alone. Do not trade the absolute security of your hard-earned retirement for a cheap, temporary illusion that will inevitably leave you broken, destitute, and begging for a flight home. I am existing now simply as a warning, a completely ruined lighthouse built upon the jagged rocks of my own monumental failure, shining a harsh light to stop you from crashing your ship. I lost my money, my dignity, and my future because I was too arrogant and too lonely to accept the brutal truth that genuine love cannot be purchased with a foreign pension. Keep your money safe in your own country, protect your heart from these meticulously crafted fantasies, and accept that aging alone with your dignity is infinitely better than dying broke in the gutter. Don't be the foolish old man who sacrificed everything for a lie. Guard your life's work, because out there they are waiting to take absolutely everything you have. Tell me honestly, do you think I was stupid or just lonely? How many men do you think are living this story right now and don't even know it yet? If this opened your eyes, share it with someone who needs to hear it.